such a disciplined group. The silence the moment we walked in. The secretary has quite a, we're going to have you teach here, quite an impact. Good afternoon and welcome to everybody. Delighted that you're all here. I am Felix Matos Rodriguez, the president here at Queens College, and I'm delighted that you come here to be with us this afternoon as we welcome Treasury Secretary Jacob J, and also the moderator for this conversation, who is David Brancaccio, who many of you probably are familiar with his marketplace show at NPR. Before we begin, I'd like to thank the to put this together, and maybe I shouldn't touch the microphone. And so I want to thank the Dean of Social Science, Michael Wolf. Thank you, Michael, for all your work in helping us publicize and get the event together. And obviously, the president of the Student Association, Japnet Singh. I don't know if Japnet is here. Here, okay, you can stand and get a shout out. Thank you for all your help in making the forum possible. We are delighted to have Secretary Liu with us here this afternoon. He's a man that the New York Times has called the most unassuming power broker in Washington. And he is the nation's 76th Secretary of the Treasury, a position that was first held by the very popular Alexander Hamilton. And I understand that the secretary is trying to convince Lin-Manuel to write a Broadway show based on his life once his service ends. There was quite a buzz on campus when we announced that the secretary was coming to the campus, as we have about 2,000 students who are majoring in either accounting or in business, making us the third largest business program in New York State. So there was quite an interest in the conversation with the secretary. The secretary, like many of our students, is a first-generation American, as his father came into this country from Poland. He's also no stranger to our college, and we actually were walking around the campus, and he remembered parts of the campus because he was born and grew up right here in Queens, in Forest Hills, and two of his sisters received their diplomas from the college. Secretary Liu himself didn't. He went to some okay schools. He got the BA from Harvard, and then did his law degree over at Georgetown. So we have family links with the secretary's family. He has quite a resume. When he was still in college, he worked for the legendary New York Congresswoman Bella Asbrook, and he later became a senior policy advisor to the House Speaker Tip O'Neill. He spent some time in private practice after getting his law degree at Georgetown before President Bill Clinton chose him to be a special assistant back in 1993. He then went on to hold several positions during the Clinton administration years, including the director of the Office of Budget and Management, arguably either the most influential person in DC and not always the best liked one in that role. And he held that position until the very early years, in the very early years of the Obama administration. In February of 2013, he was sworn in as the Secretary of the Treasury, and I know firsthand how committed the Secretary has been to the work in the Obama administration. I actually got introduced to him personally. He was calling on behalf of the President to support legislation that was before Congress related to Puerto Rico, and it was an 8:30 a.m. phone call, and he was returning on a plane from China. Right? And you can imagine there were plenty of things waiting for him to be done after having, been in an important meeting in China. But he was always working very hard to advance the president's agenda. There are very few people who have had a clear view of the economic challenges of the last decade and our nation's recovery than Secretary Liu. So we feel honored that he has chosen Queens College to come to our campus to share his thoughts, his insights on our economy with our students. So please give a warm Queens College welcome to our moderator, David Brancaccio, and to our esteemed guest, Secretary Jacob Liu.
President Rodriguez, thank you so much for welcoming us to this wonderful campus. Just quick read of the room. Show of hands. How many people are undergraduate students here? All right, so this is what the room we have here. How many of the people in the room, on a semi-regular basis, follow news of financial markets? That's pretty good size. How many people here care in any way about the job market in the United States? Okay, just setting the agenda here a little bit. Secretary Liu, thanks for doing this.
Well, thank you, David, for hosting, and President Rodriguez, thank you for the very warm introduction, and to this team here at Queens College for arranging this forum. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
The format's going to be, I'm going to do like one of my television or radio interviews, that type of thing, for 15 minutes. So I'm going to hold it to 15 minutes because this is the student town hall. This is really your event. So it'll be up to you to come to the microphones, only ask two things, say your name, please, and actually ask a question. That helps us. And, I'll see if I can cleave to my own rule here. Shorter questions are better than longer questions. One time, the biggest political story in the United Kingdom was Margaret Thatcher, the Prime Minister, had been toppled in a party coup. Biggest political story in a generation. And she did her first broadcast interview. And I was thinking, what would be the cool question the anchorman will ask? I had a really long question I would ask her if it was up to me. He says, Mrs. Thatcher has resigned. Joining me is Margaret Thatcher. Mrs. Thatcher, what gives? 2-syllable question. I was not worthy. All right, I got a 8-question first question, Secretary. During your term, has the world financial system become a safer place?
David, I think by any measure, the world financial system is safer than it was when we came in 8 years ago. And I think by almost any measure, it's safer than it was when I took the job 3.5, almost 4 years ago. You know, at the bottom of the economic cycle after the financial crisis, we were really not able to say where the economic collapse would stop. What it took was the United States leading other countries to come in, put a lot of resources to bear to get the economy moving again, to reform the economics and the regulation of the financial sector to make it safer, and to get the system moving again. I think that what you've seen in the last 8 years in the United States is disappointing to many of us because we always want to do better. But around the world, people look at the United States and see it as a model of resilience because we've bounced back. We've created 15 million new jobs. We have an economy that's been growing. The challenge we have is how to make sure that the rest of the world grows and how do we grow faster. I think having the foundation of a financial system that people have more confidence in is key to that. During the financial crisis, banks didn't have enough capital. They didn't have enough money behind their own risk so that they could bear the risk they were taking. Regulators didn't have a clear enough picture of what was happening inside financial institutions. And if they failed, there wasn't a clear enough way to work through the resolution of the system. We've made a lot of progress in all of those areas. We've also created a new Consumer Protection Bureau, and that is protecting consumers so that they know what the mortgages that they're signing mean. They know what the terms of car loans mean. And if things are done in a way that's deceptive, they can catch it and stop it. Is there more to do? There's always more to do. But in the United States, we've made an enormous amount of progress. I think if you look across into Europe, the United Kingdom has done many of the things we've done, and Europe is just a step behind. and other countries of the world are joining together. There's still more to do. We work when we meet at international meetings to make sure that we're worrying not about what happened in 2007, but what are the risks of the future, and are we taking the steps we need to make sure that we're safeguarding our publics from future risks. This is not work that begins or ends in one term. One of the mistakes between really the Great Depression and the financial crisis was too many decades went by without changing how we think about regulating a financial system that is constantly evolving. We can't take 5, 10, or 20 years off ever again.
Well, you alluded to this just now, that we were flying a little bit blind during the last great financial crisis. And one of the mechanisms set up to help is called the Financial Stability Oversight Council. You preside over that, right?
Yes.
So I imagine a really cool situation room with flat screen monitors in which all you guys and women are putting out financial fires in real time. Is that what it's like to sit there?
Well, it's not quite that exciting. The Financial Stability Oversight Council is all of the regulators who individually see a piece of the financial system brought together in one group, where the overriding responsibility that the group has is not to ask, are we doing X right or Y right, but overall, do we see financial stability risk? So you'll have one regulator who sees what's happening in the securities industry, another in the commodities trading, another in the kind of traditional banking industry, all coming together saying, what are the risks that we need to worry about? And we have the authority to designate institutions that we think require additional oversight, and in certain cases to recommend action for some of the constituent bodies to take. There's, I think, a lot of questions that have been asked about the Financial Stability Oversight Council because it's new. In a way, it takes independent regulators and brings them together to act collectively while leaving them each with their independent authority, which is a delicate balance. I think we're in a lot better place with a body like that and with a group that knows that we're supposed to be asking the hard questions about what are the risks of the future. What are the risks in things like money market funds? What are the risks in things that are not regulated like hedge funds? What are the risks that we need to be asking questions about? It's not in every case that the answer is we need to do something now. But what we do need to do is make sure that if there's action that needs to be taken, we spot it in time to take action. And that balance is one that is also difficult to strike. I think that there are many in the industry who wish we wouldn't ask so many questions. I have said on many occasions, we have to be able to ask every question, and we don't have to answer every question with a new regulation. But if there's a risk, we do need to address it.
You mentioned money market funds. There's a time we didn't think there was any risk in those things, yet there are questions to be asked.
Right. During the financial crisis, money market funds were right at the center of where some of the risk was greatest, because many of us think about money market funds as kind of savings accounts where you put
some people call them cash.
Cash. But on a daily basis, money market funds are lending money to large financial institutions, taking securities, exchanging them for liquidity. And if all of a sudden they seized up and weren't able to function, it could have stopped the whole financial system in its tracks. I think since the financial crisis, there is much more transparency. Some rules have been put in place that govern what happens if there's a problem. And there's also been some shifting around of where resources are settling in so that the risk is not as concentrated. I didn't mean to single them out as the only area, but it's an area that is worth asking questions about precisely because it was thought of as having no risk, when in fact, since the financial crisis, we've taken steps to make it safer.
Now, I'm not sure there's economic data that underlies the following adage in financial markets, but it is said that a big financial crisis happens every 7 years on average. And so 2008, 2009 financial crisis, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. How worried are you about something big happening soon? And are you most worried about the spark that might light it coming from abroad?
I think that the kind of rules of thumb about when financial crises or recessions come ought not to govern how we think about each day that we lead. We need to be cautious and prudent year 1, year 2, year 3, all the way, and I hope that it's many more years before there's another incident that causes deep concern. I can tell you that these last few months, we've gone through a number of pretty tense moments in the global financial world. When Great Britain, the United Kingdom, voted to leave the European Union, there were a lot of concerns that that might spark a set of financial worries. I think what you saw coming out of that vote was a number of very important things. First, there was very close coordination amongst central banks, amongst finance ministers, amongst financial institutions to make sure that in the days following the vote, no one had to worry about liquidity and the accelerant of fear was taken way down. I think there was something else happening. Everyone knew that the first question you asked me, the answer was we're a lot safer. US banks, UK banks are better capitalized, they're more transparent, and there is the ability to work through problems in a different way. I don't think we're immune from financial shocks. They will come over time, but we're in a much better position to deal with them. If you go back to like the 2012 period, we worried deeply that financial problems in Europe could spill over if major banks in Europe were to fail. In Europe now, the risk of it spilling over through the financial system is much lower than it was. It's not zero. I still pay a lot of attention to what's going on in European banks, but it's better than it was, and there's much more transparency. The European Central Bank is doing the kinds of stress tests that we do here in the United States. I think that the major financial centers are, in general, in a better place across the board than they were before the crisis. Everyone looks to what could be the spark. There's many things that could be the spark. Probably the things we're looking at won't be the spark. Before the financial crisis, people didn't see exactly what was coming, which is why we have to stay so vigilant, making sure that institutions are solid, that regulators can see what's going on in real time and respond in as much as possible in a coordinated way.
And certainly it's a global effort. You just were meeting with the group of 20 and your counterparts, but you must spend a lot of time, for instance, paying attention to China. A year ago, everybody on financial markets, and certainly in my line of work, I don't think there was a news story that we wrote that didn't have China in the headline. It's something their slower growth is something to pay attention to.
I think China's slower growth is something that we're all paying attention to. I think a year ago, it wasn't just a question of China's slower growth, and it's an example of how policy is made and announced in ways that can either help or hurt the problem. Last August, China changed how it sets its exchange rate in a way that didn't move it very dramatically, but sent a signal to the world that they might be more worried about their own economy than they really were. It was communicated in a very bad way, and I remember being on the phone with my Chinese counterparts in the middle of August last summer saying, if you didn't mean this to be taken this way, you need to be out there telling people what you meant. And in fact, what they were trying to do, I believe, was move their exchange rate to be more in line with a more market-oriented exchange rate. What it was seen as was, because they made the move at a time when it went down in value, their currency, that it was an attempt to devalue dramatically. Why would you devalue dramatically? If you were worried about your economy. It took them several months, really from August until January, to settle down the anxiety and to communicate more clearly. And I think if you look at China, there are serious macroeconomic issues in China. They still have a pathway forward where they can have a soft landing. They know what they need to do. They've announced it in formal policies. The question, as in so many countries, is do they have the political will to implement the reforms that they've announced? I believe if they implement those reforms, China can have a soft landing and get to a place where it grows at a slower rate than it had been growing, but a stable and sustainable rate. If they don't make the reforms, if they don't shut down excess capacity, if they don't allow the market forces to be more forceful in driving the economy, they're going to get into a hole that they might not be able to get out of. But the jury is out. They know what they need to do. We just spent a lot of time in China, and they reassured us that they're committed to the policies of reform. But as we say, the proof of the pudding is in the eating, and announcing the policy is not enough. They have to execute, they have to implement it. And that's hard, because it's disruptive to make those changes. We will, for the remainder of the time I'm engaged, be pressing them forward, calling attention to what they need to do, giving them credit when they do the right thing, and taking them to task when they don't.
I hope you're beginning to formulate your questions, because in just like a couple of minutes, it'll be your turn here. I got a bunch. Let me just pick this one before we switch to your questions. The other day, I was on the line with the European Union's head of competition. And she said a certain Cupertino, California-based company that makes the telephone in probably many of your pockets had an illegally sweet deal from Ireland and ordered Apple to pay Ireland back $14 billion in back taxes. Now, it's true Ireland didn't ask for the money, doesn't want the money, but you don't like that ruling either. Why not?
So look, David, I understand what's driving the European Commission. They're offended, as am I, that companies can take advantage of tax loopholes and tax havens to reduce their tax bills to very low rates, if not zero. We agree with that. We've taken a lot of actions to clamp down on that. And we need to reform our tax code to make that impossible. And there's steps we could take to make it impossible. Why am I bothered by what they did? A couple of reasons. First of all, we don't make tax policy retroactively. Tax authorities make tax policy prospectively. Reaching back and making tax policy that changes the rules 10 years after is just not the way tax authorities work. Secondly, that revenue should be U.S. tax revenue. It's U.S. income, it should come home, and it should be taxed. So every dollar that is paid by that company or other companies to European tax authorities ultimately might be credited against taxes due in the United States when the money is brought home. And I'm pretty protective of our tax base. I think that if there is a problem, we should work as the kind of nations of the world together to solve it. We shouldn't be doing things that reach into each other's tax base. I know that's not how the commissioner sees it. They view it as a kind of anti-competitive move that was unfair. We view it obviously in a different light. I've made my views very clear to the authorities in Europe, but ultimately we need to fix this problem in the United States by enacting business tax reform and levying a tax on income, U.S. income, whether it comes home or not, having the U.S. tax bill paid, and then if there's some residual tax bill, other authorities are free to have their own tax laws. But they shouldn't be reaching back 10 years and taking tax revenue that ought to be coming to the United States ultimately.
Thank you. We must have some questions. Mics on either side. There's one over here too. Hi, tell us your name and your question.
My name is William Novello. I'm an undergrad here at Queens College. And I just wanted to be clear, do I get one question or two questions?
Start with one, because we might have a big line.
Fair enough. Okay, so this is for you, Secretary of Treasury. As a former member of Citigroup, the chief operating officer, to be specific, how can the American people trust you to set financial and monetary policies that won't hurt ordinary Americans and benefit Wall Street at our expense?
I've spent 25 years in public service, and I have a record of public service that I'm proud of that has shown that I always do things straight up the middle, looking at things based on analysis, based on facts. And I think you have to be careful looking at people who have been in and out of government as if you come back to government and you cannot behave in that kind of a objective, analytic way. I think if you look at the actions that I've taken as Secretary of the Treasury, they speak for themselves. I have not been seen in any way as anything but tough to make sure that we use our authorities to make sure the system is as safe as we can make it. and I'm proud of the record of accomplishment that we've had.
William, thank you. Over here, sir, your name?
Yes, hi. I'm Anthony Santana. I'm an adjunct professor at Queens College in the economics department. So Secretary Liu, you were a leader at OMB in the Clinton era when we had significant fiscal austerity and surpluses. My congratulations. One of the few budget surpluses in U.S. history. But at the same time, the U.S. had record 3% plus growth. So lately, the U.S. has not been able to reprise that growth since the 2008 financial crisis. So short-term budget reasons aside, do you see any long-term or serious structural headwinds that are keeping the U.S. economy from fulfilling its full potential?
You know, I think that the 1990s were a very different time than the last 8 years. I was very proud of helping to balance the budget, not just for 1 year, but for 3 years running. Hasn't happened since the beginning of the 19th century, and probably it'll be a while before anyone can claim the same record. These have not been the years to balance the budget. These have been years to get our economy moving again. We've reduced the deficit from 10% of our economy, 10% of GDP, to 2.5%. That's the fastest rate of reduction in deficits since the end of World War II, when we were demobilizing. And if anything, I frankly think we reduced the deficit somewhat faster than we should have. If I had my choice in 2011, 2012, we would have done less deficit reduction in the short term, more deficit reduction in the medium and long term, and we would have gotten a little bit of extra boost to the economy when it needed it. With that said, I think if you look in the four corners of the U.S. economy, we're doing reasonably well. One of the headwinds that we're pushing back against is the fact that the global economy has been growing more slowly than our own. We've probably lost 0.5% of GDP in each of the last couple of years because of the slower growth in the rest of the world's economy. It's one of the reasons when I go to meetings like the G20 meetings, I just press as hard as I can for other countries to use all the policy tools at their disposal. Not just monetary policy, but fiscal policy and structural reforms. In the United States, structural reform meant fixing our financial system. In Europe, it has a different meaning. They have labor market reforms that they need to look to and other things that are just not U.S. problems. We've got to have solid economies that can be flexible and bounce back, but you need to use fiscal policy where there's fiscal space available. We've actually, in the last year, made progress having that message break through. I would say 4 years ago, there was a very, very robust debate between some forces that were for austerity and us leading the charge for growth. That argument is over. It's now a question of how do we grow? And you're seeing countries use fiscal space really around the world. You're seeing it in China and Canada. You're seeing it in South Korea and Japan. You're even seeing it in Europe. Not every country has fiscal space. Some countries actually have to worry about their short-term deficits still. But all the tools have to be used, because if you rely too much on one lever, it just can't do the job. We needed monetary policy, we needed fiscal policy, and we needed to fix our financial system, which was structural reform. I think that the more we can get other countries in the world to do that, the more it will help. I think that the challenge we face is not just the absolute amount of growth, but it's making sure that the growth is something that's experienced by working people as well as shareholders. And I think that is as important a theme for us to focus on in the United States and around the world as the number itself.
Thank you.
Question over here.
My name is Jeremy Magno. I'm an undergraduate studying economics and urban studies. Post-2008 financial recession, many called for individual bankers and executives to be indicted and sent to prison. Films like The Big Short sensationalized how big a hand individual actors had in the crisis. If the adage bankers don't get time, they get fines, were changed, how would you have foreseen the economic landscape of the U.S. going forward post-recession? Would this have created a safer financial ecosystem? Obviously, recently there's the Wells Fargo case. At what point do we say that fines are not a deterrent for financial innovation that skirts, needed regulation?
You know, the decision on who should be prosecuted is obviously made by the Justice Department. That is not an authority that either the regulators or I generally have. Our view is that no individual or no firm is too big to jail or should be too big to fail. And we have been quite aggressive using our authority to levy fines and to put a spotlight on violations. I have to leave it to law enforcement authorities to reach a conclusion as to when a prosecution is appropriate and when it's not. But obviously, the question of holding firms and individuals accountable is very important. One of the things we're still pressing to do is to make progress on executive compensation, because one of the things that is a signal to the private sector is the impact that responsibility for financial problems has on compensation. And I'm still hopeful that that's something, there's many regulators who have a piece of that, but it's still something we're working to complete.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Judah Powers. I'm an undergraduate student here. You mentioned while talking about that unnamed company in Cupertino that you have issues with tax loopholes and people
Yeah, you're sort of
I
there.
can hear you.
and people getting around the money that they owe.
Just hold it close.
Would you be in favor of a heavy tax simplification in this country along the lines of what some of the Republican candidates this year might have suggested, being able to file taxes on the back of a postcard, for instance?
Tax simplification.
You know, tax simplification is everybody's goal, and one of the reasons it's hard to achieve is that in order to avoid having a tax code that is kind of heavy-handed and that has like lots of cliffs where you earn $1 more and you're just going from category A to category B, is that it requires some calculations. So you don't want somebody to lose the earned income tax credit completely if they earn $1 more. You want it to phase out. Things like phase outs, unfortunately, require some calculations. With that said, we can and are doing a lot better to simplify the forms. The fact that we work closely, not just within government, but with the various firms that prepare tax preparation software to try and simplify the process as much as possible. I certainly would love to be able to make the process of filing taxes be effortless, but we have to also be careful not to do damage to a system that actually provides substantial benefit when you look at what some of the calculations do, even for kind of regular working people.
Thanks. Excuse me.
Hi, I'm Joshua Lichtman. I have a question regarding the low interest rates that the government has been keeping in place since the end of the financial crisis. And from what I understand, the money supply more than doubled in those 7-8 years, but inflation has stayed low. Can you explain how that works, that the money supply is increasing, but inflation is not going through the roof?
You know, I think that getting inflation up, when I was your age, if anyone had told me central bankers and finance ministers would be worrying about how do we increase inflation, I would have thought, that day will never come. You get together with central bank governors and finance ministers, and in a lot of parts of the world, getting inflation even to be above zero has been a challenge. And if you look at the U.S., core inflation has been creeping up. It's still very low. I think that it is premature to worry about hyperinflation. So I think people who talk about the 70s, we're far, far, far from that. The question is, how do you get the economy growing in a way that people are confident will continue? And frankly, how do you create a little pressure on wages? One of the things that we've been concerned about in the recovery is that for the first long beginning period of the recovery, there was very little wage growth. That's in the last year started to tick up. But once you start seeing wage growth, you then start seeing that flow through into a little bit more inflation. A little bit of inflation caused by wages for people who are working at middle class wages would not be a bad thing. because that's one of the ways that some of the benefits of growth gets back into the economy through the paychecks of working men and women. I think that it's a mistake to disregard concerns about inflation, and it's not principally my job. The Fed is responsible for balancing its consideration of employment and inflation. But I think if you look at what we try to accomplish, we would like to see a growing labor market. We would like to see more demand for labor, and we're happy to see some pressure upwards on wages. I think we're still at in a place where it's premature to be overly concerned.
Do you worry that interest rates have gotten so low that central banks don't have the firepower they should if we do bump into another crisis?
I think that there are a lot of tools. Obviously, I'm going to leave to my colleagues at the Fed any comment on interest rates. I think that this has been an unusual recovery in that around the world, policy has been driven more by monetary authorities proportionately than by fiscal authorities. You had in major economies austerity measures on the fiscal side while a recovery was still in its very early stages. As we watched this recovery in the United States develop, it took years into the recovery for government spending to not be a headwind. That means government wasn't even keeping up the pace of employment during the early years of the recovery. That's kind of reversed as we've seen some budget agreements that have put more of the budgetary savings in the out years and less in the front years. But that's not been what we've experienced in other lesser recessions. I think it's important to use fiscal tools as well as monetary tools. I think that we have tools available to deal with situations on the fiscal side, and I think monetary authorities continue to have tools. I think it's also important to recognize that low interest rates are one of the things that help drive a recovery. The reason that people are buying cars with great ease is it's easy to finance cars. The reason that we're seeing a recovery in housing is it's easy to get affordable mortgages. That's a good thing in an economy that is doing okay, but we'd like to see it doing even better. So I think that while low interest rates cause some concerns, they also have some benefits. And as I say, if you had asked me in 1979 whether I would ever have to explain why low interest rates were not a bad thing, I remember my first mortgage had a double-digit interest rate.
It was like 12 or 14 or something like that?
It was a double-digit interest rate.
Oh, my goodness.
That sounds today like something that you couldn't make up. And that's not a good thing either.
My local bank, I did a commercial for it when I was a Cub radio guy. And they were offering, if you just on your savings account, 5.25% interest. I mean, those were different days. You have a question?
Yes. Hi, Secretary Liu. My name is Gabrielle Kavoska. I'm an undergraduate student at Queens College. Firstly, I would like to thank you for coming out to QC. It's an honor to speak to you. And my question to you is, are you worried about the perception that the Fed is merely accommodating the U.S. government by buying so much of its debt? And are you worried that the Fed will lose credibility, making cost of issuing U.S. Treasury and debt more expensive?
I think the market for U.S. Treasuries remains very deep and very broad. I'm not worried about the health of the U.S. Treasury market. So I think we have remained for the world the definition of the risk-free security, and I hope that that remains the case for some time to come.
Thank you.
Question over here.
Good afternoon, Secretary Liu. Thank you for coming to speak with us. My name is Nigel Barker, finance major here at Queens College. And the sort of consensus that I've been hearing is concerns of employment after we graduate. How can we keep the economy growing? To sort of shift the onus to us, what are some things that you would recommend us to do as we go out into the world and sort of face this uncertainty of employment? Any advice on that end of how we can continue to be marketable in that arena?
Let me start with the first and most important thing. Finish your degrees. A partial degree is far, far, far less valuable than a completed degree. And if you look at the performance in initial jobs and kind of beyond that, finishing a degree is the most significant thing you can do to give yourself a leg up. I will also say, just as a general matter of advice, take some risks. When you're young is when you can take jobs if they're interesting, if it's working with people who are interesting. Don't set your mind on the one thing that you want to do, because your interests are going to change as you experience things outside. I think the most important thing when you pick a job is actually asking, who am I going to work with, and is what I'm going to be doing interesting? If the answer to those two questions is yes, I don't think, especially when you're young, you can make a mistake. And I say this to people when they come into my office and ask me for advice. Be willing to roll up your sleeves and do whatever has to be done. I found that when I was starting out and today, people who are willing to just do the work to get things done, get given more work and more interesting work, and end up with broader horizons. People who say, no, I don't do X, whether it's copying, people don't copy anymore, but in my day it was copying, doing things that you don't really want to be doing. Showing that you're focused on kind of executing on the task of wherever you are, getting it done right, and sticking with it until it's finished and successful. People who do that get reputations that earn them more responsibility and more opportunity.
Sir.
Good evening, Secretary Liu. My name is Alan Yazdan, and I'm an undergrad student here at Queens College. My question is, how long do you think the negative interest rate environment in Europe will last?
I'm not going to predict time on any of these. I think it's a mistake to think that any of us know with certainty. I can tell you that I think what's most important for Europe right now is to continue to use all of its policy tools. In some countries, that means using some more fiscal space to jumpstart their economies. In some countries, that means fixing some very broken systems that are holding them back. If employers are afraid to hire people because they have a labor system where they can never reduce their workforce, that ends up slowing the growth of jobs. I'm all for protecting workers. In the United States, we protect workers, but we also let firms fail, and then out of the failed firms come new opportunities. It's called creative destruction, but our economy bounces back. Europe doesn't have that. It's very brittle. So they need to use fiscal space. They need to use the structural reforms. And the monetary authorities have made clear that they still have room to use additional tools as they need to. I think that Europe could be doing better if it had been using all of the policy levers a little more aggressively, a little earlier. And it's not too late.
I won't forget you, but I just want to offer the longer line. Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to take the next question from this line.
Good afternoon, Secretary Liu. Thanks for being here. My name is Neil Solomon. I'm an undergrad student and a political science major. Our national debt is quickly approaching $20 trillion, which is no small amount. My question is, what is the administration's view of the situation, and is there a plan to solve this?
So, our economy is also growing, and if you look at the debt as a percentage of the economy, it's stabilized. When we took office, it was taking off quickly, and it's stabilized. Now, that doesn't mean it's not a lot of debt, but it's a sustainable amount of debt with the annual deficit in an area that is not creating immediate risk. It's essentially a deficit that is the debt service cost of our debt. We're not incurring new debt for the purpose of new spending, called primary balance. I think that was an enormous accomplishment because when we took office with a deficit of 10% of GDP, that wasn't the case. We were rapidly getting to a place where we would just not be able to support the debt. I think right now, if you ask me what is the more immediate problem, is the more immediate problem reducing the debt or dealing with the backlog of infrastructure needs we have in this country? I actually think infrastructure is a more immediate problem. If our airports and our seaports and our roads are not sufficient to carry people and commerce in the 21st century, we'll start falling behind. And then even with a smaller debt, it will be harder to service the debt. So today, if you gave me the choice of a bit more debt and an increase in spending on infrastructure, I think that's the more immediate challenge. I don't think we have to increase the debt to pay for infrastructure. There are other ways to do it. If we did tax reform, it will generate income to pay for infrastructure. I'm just trying to give you a sense of the kind of sense of urgency that I feel. I think we have done an enormously successful job bringing the deficit and the debt to a sustainable point. It will fall to others to do what I did in the 1990s and reach balance. This would be the wrong moment.
Good afternoon, Secretary Liu. My name is Japneet Singh, student body president here at Queens College. First off, thank you so much for joining us. It's an absolute pleasure. And you know, we've been talking about budgets. We talked about the economy, the infrastructure. I want to bring up investment education. As you may know, CUNY has over 500,000 students and is one of the largest public institutions within the United States. This past year was huge in terms of tuition for kids, for students, and contracts for faculty. Here at CUNY, and really bringing the issues we have to the forefront. There was also conversations on, it was about to happen that CUNY was about to be cut by $485 million with Governor Cuomo's original plan, but we were able to avoid that. However, we were left, you know, the college presidents, CUNY Board of Trustees, the Chancellor of the university was left to make a lot of difficult decisions on behalf of the university, and soon these conversations will again begin. So do you think there will be more focus from the federal level to help address the needs and issues we have here at CUNY?
Well, first of all, I think you know, Queens College and CUNY generally is just an extraordinary asset for New York City. I'm going to, one correction for President Rodriguez. My sister went to Queens College. It was my aunt who's the other family member who turns 90 next month. And so we have a long history in our family of taking advantage of the fact that there's an affordable college education available here at Queens College. Now, at a federal level, we do things like Pell Grants that go a long way towards, for those in financial need, paying a tuition bill, which is I think $6,600 now here at Queens College. But I was saying to the president as we walked, I was struck that in 08-09, the tuition was $4,200. A 50% increase between 08-09 and now is not insignificant. And you have to ask, why is that happening? It's still affordable compared to most college education. The president was telling me that 75% of the students graduate without any indebtedness, which you couldn't say at most campuses in this country. But it still reflects more pressure to have a 50% increase in a relatively short period of time. I think what I was saying before about the pressure on public budgets is probably part of the explanation. During this recovery, instead of expanding the space for public spending, we were seeing the space shrink. And that translates into pressure. I don't know that there's direct federal assistance that would be unique to a public system like CUNY or Queens College. But I do think that making sure we pay for Pell Grants and having other forms of assistance for students who are in need, I think making sure that we run the student loan program in a way where it provides understandable and affordable financing and repayment terms that are consistent with opening opportunities, not closing opportunities, which we've done through the income contingent repayment program. Those are the kinds of things we should do at a federal level. I think it falls to city and state authorities to make the decision on how much public funding goes into a specific institution. One of the things we've done at the federal level, and this isn't really a Queens College issue, but it kind of related, is we've said that we ought to look at two-year colleges, community colleges, and we ought to find a way to make it free anywhere in this country to get a community college degree if you finish. Because what I was saying before about finishing Queens College, getting your four-year degree, there's an awful lot of people in this country who, if they could get the 2 years or the 3 years at a community college, could help fill the jobs that are open in this country. Right now, today, we have 3 to 4 million jobs in this country open, and roughly 3 to 4 million people looking for work. What we have is a mismatch of skills. That's something we know how to solve. I think part of that is four-year colleges, part of it is graduate school, part of it is community colleges. And I think we have to look at what we can do at each level to get our economy working and take advantage of the human capital, which is just precious to our social fabric and our economic future.
Now you have to look at your watches. We only have 5 minutes, so we get to turn this into a lightning round. The questions have been quite
succinct.
succinct.
Questions and then I'll answer.
Yeah.
So take 2 or 3 questions, then I'll answer.
Yeah, that's what we'll do. So short versions of the questions. Let's whip through these 4 nice people. Starting with your name.
My name is Ramesh. Good evening, sir. My major is in economics and accounting. My question is regarding bonds in Italy and Spain. They're now trading at negative yields. To what extent would you say the European governments and ECB and U.S. government and the Fed are responsible for the negative yields?
Cool, thank you. Next question.
So my question is, my name is Luis Mendez, and my question is, the massive increases in the government debt globally, with the interest rate environment punishing savers globally, is creating massive distortions in savings and investments. Isn't it time for governments and central banks to take themselves out of the markets?
Okay. Savings. Yes?
Hi, I'm Michael Bennett. I'm an undergraduate here. I read your recent essay in the last issue of Foreign Affairs, and I saw your views on the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. I was just wondering what your views would be on the creation of one here, and if the next administration should focus on that.
Hi, thank you, Secretary, for being here. My name is Dylan Chabali. I'm an undergrad here. I want to know why we haven't got rid of the penny yet and taken the lead that Canada and Australia and many other Western Anglo countries have taken, and is Big Zinc involved, and et cetera. So just
okay.
One more over here.
Okay. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Mohammed Chaudhry. I'm a economics major here. Doing economics major. My question is that we see central banks around the world are going for unusual policies, hitting the negative rates and everything. Do you still think, in the perspective of the U.S. Treasury, the world is still in recession, or are we just, as a world, we're just reaching for growth? Which is it? Are we still in recession or reaching for growth?
So let me see if I can remember all these questions. I'm going to do my best.
I wrote them down, so do your best.
On the question of growth and negative rates, obviously the European Central Bank has been pursuing a policy of buying bonds to help grow the economies in Europe. I think it's important that Europe is pursuing a monetary policy aimed at growth. I think I've made clear that there need to be other tools used in Europe, and there's an awful lot of pressure that's put on monetary authorities when other tools are not being used. I think the world is in recovery. I mean, we're at a moment where the U.S. is in a stable and sustained recovery. It's a little bit weaker in other parts of the world. Europe is positive, but it was only barely positive till about a year ago. Japan is having a hard time pulling itself out of almost 2 decades of an economic kind of slowdown. And now, as we talked before, people are worried about China growing, but not growing as fast as it was. I think that's why it's so important that as a kind of world community, we ask the question about what can we do to grow our economies individually so that collectively there's better performance. One thing I know for sure, it's not possible for the U.S. economy alone to pull the entire engine of the global economy. We have a great economy. We have strong consumers. We are resilient. We bounce back. But population is growing in the rest of the world. Economies have to grow in other parts of the world because we can't grow for everyone. The American consumer can't drive demand everywhere. The question that was asked about the Asia Infrastructure Bank, I think it's a good thing that we're seeing more resources committed to development and to growing, investing in infrastructure and growing the economies in Asia. The concern we had was not about investing in Asia. The concern we raised was making sure that that institution do its work at a very high standard and not do it at a standard that competes with the World Bank or the Asia Development Bank by offering loans with less secure economics, with weaker business practices, with lower labor standards, lower environmental standards. I think we've actually succeeded. We've gotten the Asia Infrastructure Bank to commit to meeting high standards, and they consult closely with us in trying to reach high standards. The jury is out. They haven't done an awful lot of new loans, but I certainly hope that they meet the standards that they're shooting for. The question on the penny. You know, I put an awful lot of attention into our paper currency in my time at Treasury, and I was very proud to announce that we're going to be redesigning our currency, putting Harriet Tubman on the $20 bill, introducing into our $5 and $10 bills themes that reflect a broader history of our great country, including some of the great iconic events that happened at the Lincoln Memorial and the history of women's suffrage. I think I've probably done more to rethink how we handle our currency than most of my recent predecessors. There's clearly questions to be asked about coinage. The penny does cost more to produce than a penny. Most pennies end up in a jar or in a shoebox, but people are still very attached to getting exact change. It's a multi-year process if you were going to remove pennies from circulation. And I think that we have done a bunch of work that won't get completed in our time, but sits there and is ready to be picked up by somebody else. There's always more work to do.
In the 30 seconds we have left and connected to this, I think we covered this on our air at one point. Why did you upgrade your signature on the dollar bills? Your original looked like a slinky, and I thought it was pretty cool, but you changed your signature.
You know, the truth is, I signed my name 10 times and we picked the one we liked. I didn't go through any retraining. When I was growing up in the New York City public schools, I wasn't a bad student. The one thing I had a challenge with was penmanship.
Oh dear. Secretary Jacob J, thank you very much. I want to thank you. Your questions were spectacular. I didn't expect any less from Queens College bunch, but you did this campus proud. Thank you very much.
Thank you all very much.